When you've shared your life with someone for 4 decades, you assume you've seen every side of them. Their laughter, their anger, their tears. You think you know their darkest secrets and their brightest dreams. But all it takes is one conversation to shatter the mirror of familiarity, leaving you staring at a stranger where your partner once stood. That conversation began on a quiet Friday evening. The house was silent except for the hum of the dishwasher and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. I had just poured us 2 glasses of Merlot, intending to enjoy a peaceful night with Alice, my wife, my partner of 40 years. She had a distant look in her eyes, but I chalked it up to her usual pre-weekend fatigue. I handed her a glass, settling beside her on the couch. "To us," I said, raising mine. She smiled faintly, clinking her glass against mine, but there was no warmth behind it. Then came the words that turned my world upside down. "James, we need to talk." Now, in movies, that phrase is a cliché. But in real life, when your spouse of 4 decades says it with a trembling voice, it's a gunshot that echoes in your chest. I felt my throat tighten as I nodded, gesturing for her to continue. I've been feeling trapped. There are things I need to tell you. Things I should have told you years ago. Years ago. The weight of those words pressed down on me like a lead blanket. I forced a smile, trying to keep the atmosphere calm. "Alice, whatever it is, we'll work through it together. We always do." But then she dropped the bombshell. "I've been in love with someone else for over a decade." The room spun. My grip on the wine glass faltered, and crimson droplets splashed onto the beige carpet. My heart raced as her words sank in, each one a dagger aimed directly at the memories we had built together. What are you saying?" My voice cracked, betraying the storm inside me. "Alice, this has to be some kind of cruel joke." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It's not a joke, James. I didn't want to hurt you, but I can't keep pretending anymore. This person, he's been a part of my life in ways I can't even explain. I thought I could bury it, that it would fade over time. But it hasn't." My mind raced, grappling with the enormity of what she was saying. 40 years. A lifetime of trust, laughter, arguments, and love. All of it felt like it was being stripped away, leaving me exposed and raw. "Who?" I demanded, my voice rising despite myself. "Who is this man? Someone I know?" She hesitated, and the silence spoke volumes. My blood ran cold as realization dawned. It wasn't just betrayal. It was someone close to us. "Is it Alan?" I spat, the name burning my tongue. Alan was my oldest friend, someone who had been in our lives since before Alice and I even started dating. The thought of him sneaking around, pretending to be my confidant while stabbing me in the back, made my blood boil. Alice didn't deny it. Her silence confirmed everything. I stood up, my hands trembling, my pulse pounding in my ears. "How long, Alice? How long have you two been doing this behind my back?" Her lips quivered, but no sound came out. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. 14 years. 14 years. My knees buckled, and I collapsed back onto the couch. 14 years of shared vacations, dinners, birthdays, all while she and Alan played out their twisted little drama in the shadows. Every memory now felt tainted, polluted by this revelation. "You lied to me. Every day, for years," I said, my voice icy. "You looked me in the eye and told me you loved me, while you—" I couldn't even finish the sentence. "James, I did love you. I still do," she pleaded. "But it's different." I raised a hand to silence her. Don't you dare try to justify this." Alice reached for my hand, but I pulled away as if her touch would burn me. "I know I've made mistakes," she said, her voice cracking, "but I don't want to lose you. You're my family, my anchor. Can't we find a way to move past this?" Move past this? Was she serious? My mind raced with thoughts of revenge, of humiliation, of ways to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd inflicted on me. But for now, all I could do was stare at her, wondering how the woman I loved had become a stranger before my very eyes. And then, something inside me shifted. If Alice thought she could destroy my trust and walk away unscathed, she was wrong. Dead wrong. The morning after Alice's confession, the house felt alien. Cold, unfamiliar, and silent in a way that screamed betrayal. I hadn't slept. Instead, I spent the night in my study, staring blankly at the framed photos of what I had thought was a happy life. My mind replayed her words over and over. 14 years. It was a number that haunted me. A lifetime of deceit woven into the fabric of my existence, hiding in plain sight. But wallowing wasn't enough. If Alice thought she could control the narrative, she was mistaken. If I'd learned anything in my 40 years of marriage, it was that the devil was in the details, and I was determined to uncover every last one. Alice had left for a morning walk, an activity she insisted was for clarity. I almost laughed at the irony. Clarity. The only clarity I cared about was the truth, and I wasn't going to wait for her to hand it to me. Her laptop sat on the kitchen counter, open and glowing faintly. It was practically an invitation. I hadn't snooped through her belongings in decades. Trust had rendered it unnecessary. But now, trust was a relic of the past. I reached for the device, my hands trembling, and opened her email. It didn't take long to find something. A folder labeled innocuously as projects contained a string of emails dating back years. The sender? Alan. The correspondence was infuriatingly vague at first, cloaked in work-related language. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. Phrases like, "I miss the way you smile when we're alone," and "last night was unforgettable," screamed at me from the screen. My pulse quickened as I clicked on an attachment, a photo of the two of them, arms wrapped around each other, laughing in a way I hadn't seen Alice laugh in years. I slammed the laptop shut, my breathing ragged. The evidence was damning, but I wasn't satisfied. I needed more than just emails. I needed to confront the ghost of their lies head-on. Alice returned home mid-morning, her face flushed from the brisk air. She stepped into the kitchen, the picture of domestic normalcy. It was nauseating. "James," she said softly, as if we were still playing house. "Can we talk?" I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Funny. I've been thinking the same thing." Her eyes flickered with unease. She must have sensed the shift in me. No longer the hurt, bewildered husband, but something colder, sharper. "Did you love him?" I asked bluntly. "Alan." Alice flinched as if the name alone was a slap. "James, please. Answer the question." I snapped. "Did you love him?" Her hesitation spoke volumes. "It's complicated," she finally said. I laughed, bitter and sharp. "Complicated? You don't get to use that word, Alice. Not after what you've done." "I thought I loved him," she admitted, her voice cracking. "But it wasn't the same as what we have. He was an escape. A fantasy." The words hit me like a hammer. Fantasy. My entire life with her had become collateral damage for a fantasy. 14 years, Alice, I said, my voice rising. "Do you even realize how many moments you stole from me? From us? From our family?" Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't move me. I wanted answers, not apologies. "I didn't want it to go on for so long," she whispered. "But every time I thought about ending it, I was afraid of losing you, of destroying everything we had." I stepped closer, my voice low and venomous. "Newsflash, Alice. You destroyed everything the moment you let him into your life. Don't you dare pretend this was about protecting me." Her face crumpled, and she sank into a chair, sobbing. I stood over her, unmoved. This wasn't about her pain. It was about justice. Later that day, I reached out to Alan. It wasn't difficult to track him down. He lived a few streets over, in the house where we'd shared countless backyard barbecues. My hand hovered over my phone, debating whether to call or visit. In the end, I opted for something more direct. When he opened the door, the color drained from his face. "James," he stammered, stepping back as if to shield himself. "I didn't expect." "Save it," I barked, stepping inside without invitation. "We need to talk." Alan's wife, Cynthia, appeared in the hallway, confusion etched on her face. "James, is everything okay? Why don't you ask your husband?" I suggested, fixing Alan with a glare. Cynthia's face paled as realization dawned. "James, don't do this," Alan begged, his voice trembling. "Not here." "Why not?" I said, my voice cold. You weren't concerned about discretion when you were screwing my wife, were you? The tension in the room was suffocating. Cynthia looked from Alan to me, her eyes wide with betrayal. Alan, she whispered, her voice shaking. Is this true? Alan's silence was answer enough. Cynthia let out a strangled cry and stormed upstairs, slamming the door behind her. Alan turned to me, his face a mixture of fear and fury. You didn't have to involve her, he hissed. Oh, I think I did, I replied, stepping closer. You didn't just betray me, Alan. You betrayed her, too. Alan looked away, shame painting his features. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. This isn't over, I warned, turning on my heel. Not by a long shot. As I walked away, I felt a grim satisfaction. Alice and Alan thought they could keep their dirty little secret buried, but now the ground beneath them was shifting, and I wasn't done yet. The days that followed my confrontation with Alan felt surreal, as though I were trapped in a nightmare where the rules of life had been rewritten. The trust one once had in those closest to me had shattered, leaving jagged shards that cut deeper with each passing moment. But I wasn't going to be a passive victim. No, this was a game now, a chessboard of betrayal, and I intended to make the winning move. Alice avoided me, skulking through the house like a guilty ghost. Her once confident demeanor had dissolved into quiet anxiety, her every step heavy with the weight of her actions. Meanwhile, I spent my time plotting. I wasn't going to let her dictate the terms of how this played out. The first order of business was securing evidence. My confrontation with Alan had rattled him, but I needed to make sure he wouldn't wiggle free by twisting the narrative. I returned to Alice's laptop and downloaded every incriminating email, every attachment, and every photo I could find. Each document felt like a knife to the gut, but I kept going, driven by the need to expose the truth. That evening, I called my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Sandra who had handled our family's legal matters for years. Her tone was professional, but I could sense her curiosity as I explained the situation. 40 years of marriage, and this is where you find yourself, she said, her voice carrying a hint of pity. Do you want a divorce, or are you considering other options? Divorce, I said without hesitation, but I want it on my terms, and I want to make sure Alan doesn't walk away unscathed. Sandra let out a low whistle. Revenge? Huh? Well, let's start with the practical. Do you have proof of the affair? Oh, I have proof, I replied darkly. Emails, photos, the whole sordid mess. Good, she said, her tone brisk. Gather everything and send it over. We'll also need to look into your financial situation. Make sure Alice can't siphon off assets while you're preparing for this. I thanked her and hung up, feeling the first flicker of control return to me. This was no longer about just ending the marriage. It was about ensuring Alice and Alan felt the full weight of their betrayal. The following day, I paid a visit to Cynthia, Alan's wife. It was a risky move, but one I felt was necessary. Cynthia deserved to know the truth about the man she'd built her life with, just as much as I deserved to unearth the lies that had poisoned mine. She opened the door with red-rimmed eyes, her expression guarded. James, she said, her voice hoarse. What do you want? I came to share some things you need to see, I said, holding up a folder containing the evidence I'd gathered. I know this isn't easy, but I think it's important. She hesitated, then stepped aside to let me in. We sat in her living room, a space that felt eerily similar to my own, a lifetime of memories captured in photos and keepsakes. I handed her the folder, watching as her hands trembled while she flipped through the pages. Her face crumpled as she read the emails, her breath hitching with each revelation. I knew something was off, she whispered, but I didn't want to believe it. I'm sorry, Cynthia, I said, my voice low, but I thought you should know. Alan's lies didn't just hurt me, they hurt you too. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you for telling me. I don't know what I'm going to do, but at least now I can stop living in the dark. As I left, I felt a strange mix of guilt and satisfaction. It wasn't easy to destroy someone else's world, but Alan and Alice had made their choices, and now they had to face the fallout. That evening, Alice attempted to talk to me again. She found me in the study, where I had been poring over old photographs, trying to reconcile the woman in those images with the stranger she had become. James, she began hesitantly. Can we just talk? I set down the photo album and looked at her, my expression cold. Talk about what, Alice? The 14 years you spent lying to my face? The fact that you turned our marriage into a joke? Her lips quivered, but she pressed on. I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed your trust. But I don't want this to be the end for us. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix things. Fix things? I repeated, laughing bitterly. You can't fix this, Alice. You can't erase 14 years of betrayal with a few empty promises. Her face crumpled, and she sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. I'll do anything, James. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. I don't want to lose you. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of Alan's smug face and the emails that had detailed their sordid affair. Alice might have been willing to beg for forgiveness now, but she hadn't thought about the consequences when she was sneaking around with Alan. You already lost me, Alice, I said quietly. The moment you let him into your life, you ended us. Now you have to live with that. I left her sobbing on the floor, my resolve hardening. The game was far from over, and I wasn't done making my moves. The house was quieter than ever, the weight of Alice's betrayal suffocating every corner. Each day felt like a calculated move on a chessboard of emotions and revenge, but I was determined to stay ahead. I hadn't spoken to her since our last exchange. She knew better than to push me now. But that evening, the first crack in my plan appeared. I was in the study, sifting through decades of shared memories, when my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from an unknown number. Meet me. There's something you don't know about Alice. I'll explain everything. Alan. The name sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Alan. The audacity of this man to reach out after everything was almost laughable. My instinct was to delete the message, but the last part lingered in my mind. There's something you don't know. I stared at the text for a long moment, weighing my options. What could he possibly reveal that would change the way I saw this betrayal? Could it be worse than what I already knew? Curiosity won out. I replied, Where? The response came almost instantly. 7 p.m. Blackwood Cafe. Come alone. At 7 p.m. sharp, I walked into the cafe. The dim lighting and muted hum of quiet conversation set the stage for whatever game Alan was about to play. I spotted him sitting in the far corner, nursing a coffee. He looked haggard, as though the last few days had aged him years. Good, I thought. Alan, I said curtly as I sat down. James, he replied, his voice hoarse. Thank you for coming. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see. Get to the point, I said, my tone icy. You said there's something I don't know about Alice. He nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. I'm not here to justify what I did, he said. But there's something you need to understand. I snatched the envelope and tore it open. Inside were photographs, but not the kind I expected. They were grainy, clearly taken in secret. In each one, Alice was sitting across from a man I didn't recognize. Older, well-dressed, and with a striking air of confidence. They were in a variety of settings: a restaurant, a park, even what looked like a hotel lobby. Who is this? I demanded, my pulse quickening. Alan sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. That's Arthur Blaine. He's a private investigator. And Alice hired him over a year ago. To investigate you. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. What? I breathed. She thought you were hiding something, Alan continued. Financial secrets, maybe an affair of your own. I don't know all the details, but she told me she didn't trust you anymore. The room seemed to tilt as the implication of his words sank in. Alice, the woman who had been betraying me for 14 years, had somehow convinced herself that I was the one with something to hide. That's insane, I said, shaking my head. I've done nothing but be loyal to her for 40 years. I believe you, Alan said quietly. But Alice, she started spiraling. She was paranoid, convinced you had secrets. I told her to drop it, but she wouldn't listen. My hands clenched into fists. Why are you telling me this now? Alan hesitated. Because I can't live with the guilt anymore. What we did was wrong, But Alice, she's not the person you think she is. And I thought you deserved to know. I stared at him, my mind racing. Was this some kind of twisted ploy? Or was it possible that the woman who had torn my life apart was even more deceitful than I'd realized? You're a coward, Alan, I said finally, standing up. You're trying to absolve yourself by throwing her under the bus. But don't think for a second that it makes you any less guilty. He didn't argue, just watched as I walked away, his face etched with shame. Back home, I confronted Alice. She was in the kitchen, aimlessly stirring a pot of soup, the picture of domesticity. I dropped the envelope on the counter in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You tell me," I said coldly. "Because according to Alan, you've been investigating me." Her face turned pale as she opened the envelope and saw the photos. For a moment, she was silent, her eyes darting between me and the evidence. Then, she began to stammer. "James, I can explain." "Explain? Go ahead, Alice. I'd love to hear why my wife of 40 years decided to play detective while she was sleeping with my best friend." She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I thought you were pulling away from me," she said, her voice muffled. "You were working late. You seemed distant. I thought maybe you'd found someone else. So your solution was to betray me twice over?" I said, my voice rising. "You hired someone to investigate me while you were the one having an affair?" "I was scared," she cried. "I thought I was losing you, and I didn't know how to stop it." Her excuses were pathetic, but as I stood there, a darker thought began to creep in. Alan's information raised more questions than it answered. What had Alice actually found during her so-called investigation? And why hadn't she confronted me about it? For the first time, I wondered if the real truth was still hidden. Alice's words echoed in my mind long after she retreated to the guest room. "I thought I was losing you." Her tone, the tremor in her voice, it all felt rehearsed, like a desperate attempt to shift blame and deflect from her own betrayal. But one thing stood out. She hadn't denied hiring the investigator. That alone was a damning admission. I spent the rest of the night going through my own files, trying to make sense of this twisted new layer of deception. If Alice had suspected me of hiding something, why hadn't she confronted me directly? And if she found nothing, why had she stayed silent? There had to be more to this. The next morning, I decided to get answers from the only person who could provide them. Arthur Blaine, the private investigator. Alan's intel suggested he was local, so it wasn't hard to track him down. His office was in a nondescript building downtown, tucked between a dry cleaner and a rundown diner. Blaine was a wiry man in his late 50s, with sharp eyes and a perpetual smirk that made my skin crawl. When I stepped into his office, he was seated behind a cluttered desk, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. "Mr. Hall," he greeted, clearly unsurprised by my arrival. "I was wondering when you'd show up. You know who I am?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Of course," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "Alice Hall hired me to dig into your life. But I assume you already know that." I didn't sit. "I want to know what you found," I demanded. "What did she ask you to look for?" Blaine leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. "Mrs. Hall was convinced you were hiding something. An affair, offshore accounts, maybe even a double life. She gave me free rein to investigate." "And?" I pressed, my patience wearing thin. "And," he said, dragging out the word, "I found nothing. No mistresses, no secret bank accounts, no skeletons in the closet. You, Mr. Hall, are as squeaky clean as they come." I should have felt relief, but instead, a new wave of anger surged through me. Alice had turned our marriage into a battlefield over nothing, her own paranoia and guilt warping her perception of me. "If you found nothing, why didn't she call it off?" I asked. Blaine's smirk faltered. "That's the strange part," he admitted. "After a few weeks, I gave her my report, told her you were clean. But instead of letting it go, she doubled down. She insisted there had to be something I missed. That's when I realized it wasn't about you." "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. Blaine leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Alice wasn't looking for proof of your wrongdoing. She was looking for a reason to justify her own." His words hit like a lightning bolt. Alice hadn't been investigating me to uncover the truth. She had been searching for an excuse to exonerate herself. My mind reeled as I considered the implications. Every doubt she planted, every accusation, every moment of tension in our marriage. It had all been a smokescreen for her affair. I left Blaine's office feeling both vindicated and furious. Alice's betrayal had reached a level I hadn't even considered. It wasn't just the affair with Alan or the years of deception. It was the deliberate erosion of my trust. Also, she could justify her own actions. When I returned home, Alice was in the kitchen, pretending to clean. Her nervous energy was palpable, and she flinched when she saw me enter. "You went to see him, didn't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You mean the investigator you hired to destroy my life?" I shot back. "Yes, Alice, I want to see him. And do you know what he told me? He said you weren't looking for proof. I was the proof. You were looking for a scapegoat." Her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "James, please. Don't," I snapped, slamming my hand on the counter. "Don't you dare cry, Alice. You don't get to play the victim here. You've spent years lying to me, cheating on me, and when your guilt became too much to bear, you tried to make me the villain. You are the only one responsible for this mess." She sank into a chair, sobbing. For a moment, I stood there, watching her break down, but I felt nothing. No pity, no sympathy, just a cold resolve to see this through. I spent the next few days in silent preparation. The divorce papers were already in Sandra's hands, and I had begun the process of dividing our assets. I had no intention of leaving Alice with more than the bare minimum. She could have the house. I didn't want it anymore. It was a mausoleum of broken memories. Meanwhile, I started piecing together my final move. Alice thought she could keep her secrets buried, but I wasn't done unearthing them. Blaine's words haunted me. If Alice had been willing to go to such lengths to justify herself, what else had she hidden? I needed to know. I went through her emails, her phone records, her calendar, everything I could get my hands on, and then I found it. An encrypted folder on her laptop, labeled innocuously as bills. It took some effort, but I managed to crack it. Inside were messages, receipts, and photos, proof that Alice's betrayal went even deeper than I'd imagined. But the true shock came in the form of a message exchange dated 2 months ago. It wasn't from Alan. It was from someone else. The conversation was brief, but damning. Alice had been meeting with a third party, discussing what could only be described as blackmail. She had been working with Alan to manipulate me, and now, it seemed, she had dragged someone else into her schemes. I stared at the screen, my fury building with every passing second. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was war. And in war, only one side emerges victorious. The encrypted messages burned in my mind long after I discovered them. Alice's duplicity was a bottomless pit. Just when I thought I'd reached its depths, I uncovered something even darker. The correspondence with this third party was cryptic, but the intent was clear. Alice wasn't just hiding an affair. She was orchestrating something bigger, something designed to hurt me on a scale I hadn't anticipated. I sat at my desk, staring at the evidence I'd gathered. The receipts, the dates, the payments, all of it painted a damning picture. This wasn't just infidelity or betrayal. It was premeditated sabotage. Alice and Alan weren't content to destroy my marriage. They were targeting my life, my reputation, my very existence. But now, I had the upper hand, and I was going to use it. The first step was a conversation with Sandra, my lawyer. I met her at her office the next morning, bringing along the new evidence. "This is worse than I thought," she said, flipping through the printed messages. Her usual calm demeanor was replaced with a thinly veiled fury. "James, this isn't just grounds for divorce. This could be criminal." "Exactly," I replied, my voice steady. "That's why I need your help. I want to ensure Alice and everyone involved pays for this." Sandra nodded. "We'll start with an injunction to freeze joint assets. If she's funneling money to this third party, we can cut her off immediately. But I'll need more information. Who is this person, and what's their connection to Alice?" "That's what I intend to find out," I said. Before leaving her office, I transferred my personal funds into a separate account and began the process of securing my financial future. Alice wouldn't see a penny of what I had worked so hard to build. Not if I could help it. Back home, I played the part of the indifferent husband. Alice, oblivious to what I had discovered, was clearly unraveling. Her attempts to engage me in conversation were half-hearted at best, her guilt manifesting in nervous gestures and forced smiles. That evening, I set the trap. Using a burner phone, I crafted an anonymous message to the third party, posing as Alice. "We need to meet. There's a problem." Same place as before. I sent the message and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. An hour later, the reply came. "Tomorrow at noon. Don't be late." I stared at the screen, a cold determination settling over me. Tomorrow, I would confront the stranger who had been working with my wife to dismantle my life. And I wasn't going alone. The next day, I parked a few blocks away from the meeting spot, a dingy cafe on the outskirts of town. Sandra had arranged for a private investigator to accompany me, a no-nonsense man named Victor who had seen his fair share of betrayals. "You sure about this?" Victor asked as we watched the entrance from his unmarked car. "Absolutely," I said. "I need to know who this is." At precisely noon, a figure entered the cafe, a man in his early 40s, dressed in a cheap suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He sat at a corner table, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "That's our guy," Victor muttered. "Let's go." Inside, I walked straight to the man's table, my presence startling him. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, not waiting for an answer. His confusion turned to alarm as Victor followed and took a seat beside me, blocking his exit. Who are you?" the man stammered. "James Hall," I said calmly. "Alice's husband. You've been working with her, haven't you?" The man's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." Victor leaned forward, his tone low and threatening. "Don't play dumb. We have your messages, your receipts, and your payment logs. You've got two options. Tell us everything, or we go straight to the police." The man hesitated, his gaze darting between us. "Finally," he sighed, slumping back in his chair. "Fine. What do you want to know?" "Start with your name," I said. "Greg Hammond," he muttered. "I'm a consultant." "Consultant?" I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Consultant for what, exactly?" Greg rubbed his temples, his composure cracking. "Alice hired me to dig up dirt on you. She wanted leverage, something she could use to control you if the affair ever came to light." I clenched my fists, rage simmering just below the surface. "And did you find anything?" "No," he admitted. "You're clean." But that's when Alan stepped in. The mention of Alan made my blood boil. "What did he do?" Greg hesitated, then said, "He offered to pay me extra if I helped fabricate evidence. Emails, fake receipts, stuff that would make you look guilty." Alice didn't want to go that far, but Alan, he was insistent. The weight of Greg's confession settled over me like a storm cloud. Alan's betrayal wasn't just personal. It was calculated, deliberate. He had been plotting to ruin me in every way possible, and Alice had let him. "Does Alice know about the fabricated evidence?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. Greg shook his head. "I don't think so." She wanted to back out, but Alan kept pushing. Victor leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You're going to give us everything. Every document, every payment record, every fake file you made." Greg nodded hastily. "Anything. Just don't involve the police." I stood, my anger barely contained. "If you lie, if you hide anything, I'll make sure you regret it." As I walked out of the cafe, my mind raced. The trap had been sprung, but the game wasn't over. Alan and Alice had pushed me to the edge, but they had no idea what was coming next. The storm inside me raged as I drove home from the cafe, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. Greg's confession had torn away the last threads of humanity I could attribute to Alice and Alan. This wasn't just betrayal, it was war. And I was done playing defense. Back home, I called Sandra, updating her on everything Greg had revealed. She was livid but focused. "James, this is a gift. With Greg's testimony and the fabricated evidence, we can dismantle their lies and hit them hard in court. But are you sure you want to go public with all of this?" "Absolutely," I said, my voice cold. "They wanted to ruin me. It's only fair I return the favor. Sandra promised to move quickly, coordinating with Greg to secure his cooperation in exchange for leniency. But my next move wasn't about lawyers or courts. It was personal. Alice and Alan had made this personal. That evening, Alice was in the living room, pretending to read a book. She looked up as I entered, her expression cautious. "James, can we talk?" she asked. I smiled, a calm, cold smile that made her visibly uncomfortable. "Oh, we'll talk, Alice. But first, I have something to show you." I set my laptop on the coffee table and opened the folder containing the damning evidence. Greg's messages, the fake receipts, and the payments Alan had funneled through him. Alice's face drained of color as she read through the files. What is this?" she stammered. "Your masterpiece," I said, my voice laced with venom. "You and Alan weren't just betraying me. You were trying to destroy me. And now, I have everything I need to make sure you pay for it." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I was long past caring. "James, I didn't know about the fake evidence," she pleaded. "I swear, I never wanted it to go that far. Spare me," I snapped. "You hired Greg. You set this whole thing in motion. And when Alan took it further, you didn't stop him. You're just as guilty as he is." She broke down, sobbing, but I wasn't finished. "You wanted leverage? You wanted to paint me as the bad guy? Congratulations, Alice. Now everyone will know the truth about you." The next day, I paid Alan one final visit. This time, I wasn't there to talk. I was there to deliver consequences. I parked outside his house, watching as he stepped out onto the porch. When he saw me, his expression shifted from surprise to unease. "James," he said, his voice wary. "What are you doing here?" "I thought it was time we had a chat," I said, stepping closer. Man to man. Alan tried to act composed, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "Look, I know you're upset, but—" "Upset?" I interrupted, my voice sharp. "You think I'm upset because you slept with my wife?" "No, Alan. I'm furious because you tried to destroy my life. And now it's your turn." I handed him a folder identical to the one I'd shown Alice. As he flipped through the pages, his face turned ashen. How did you get this?" he stammered. "Doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that I'm sending all of it to Cynthia and the board of directors at your company. By the time I'm done, you won't just lose your marriage. You'll lose everything." Alan's mask of bravado crumbled, replaced by desperation. "James, please. We can work something out." "There's nothing to work out," I said coldly. "You made your choices. Now live with them." Within days, the dominoes began to fall. Sandra moved swiftly, filing the divorce papers and freezing our joint assets. Greg's cooperation ensured that Alice and Alan's schemes were exposed in vivid detail. The fallout was spectacular. Cynthia filed for divorce immediately, taking Alan for everything he was worth. His company, already wary of scandal, forced him to resign. The man who once thought he could manipulate and control everyone around him was left with nothing. As for Alice, the divorce was brutal. Sandra ensured I walked away with the lion's share of our assets, while Alice was left with the house, a hollow shell of what once was. She tried to apologize, to plead for forgiveness, but I had no interest in her words. Her tears meant nothing to me now. The cherry on top came when I received a message from Greg, an additional file he hadn't disclosed earlier. It was a recording of Alice and Alan arguing, a heated exchange where Alan accused Alice of failing to keep James under control. Hearing their true thoughts about me only solidified my decision. These weren't people worth forgiving. Months later, I stood in my new home, a smaller place, but one that felt like mine. The air was lighter, free of the suffocating weight of betrayal. Alice's chapter in my life was closed, and Alan's attempt to destroy me had backfired spectacularly. As I poured myself a glass of wine, I allowed myself a rare smile. They had underestimated me, thinking I'd crumble under the weight of their lies. But I hadn't just survived, I'd won. And in the end, the game of betrayal they had started had only one victor: me.